Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot Chapter 5, Halacha 3. This is part 2 of the shiur. Today we're going to be covering errors with the Shaliach Tzibbur. The Shaliach Tzibbur's job is to repeat the Shemona Esrei and, in a lot of cases, to include a lot of the necessary prayers that have to be stated in the Shemona Esrei. Now, as we know, and as we've been covering, the Shemona Esrei was formulated by the men of the Great Assembly, and this included a makeup where more than half were prophets. And as we've covered in this, that the order has to be maintained, that you can't say things out of order, and certainly you can't forget things. There's a lot of agadic things that come up in the Midrashim, where parts of the Shemona Esrei correspond to different parts of the organs. So there's a lot of things, perhaps in the upper realms, that are happening when you're doing things to leave things out, so that it would make it more serious than just forgetting something. So anyway, this is going to be a case where or these are going to be cases where perhaps the person was saying it and he can't recall what to fix. I mean, he something is missing and perhaps he can't say it or he can't articulate it. I was in a minyan where the person was a Baal Tshuva and couldn't pronounce the letters, and it was a problem because when you're listening to it, you could interpret it as different meanings because the letters were not enunciated correctly, and the gabbai had to ask him to discontinue and to be replaced because it was creating like theological problems because of the mispronunciations. So that would be a similar case where if somebody is making a mistake and they can't continue. And they can't continue in this case because the guy can't pronounce it. You could also imagine something where perhaps the person had a speech impediment. It would be like a speech impediment because you're changing the meaning. And changing the meaning now becomes problematic. So this part of the Mishnah is saying if a prayer leader erred and he basically forgot the text and could not continue, perhaps he forgot the text, or perhaps he couldn't continue, like the case where this guy couldn't pronounce the stuff, and it was a big problem in that minyan because everybody was looking at everybody else, and it's very nice. The guy's trying very hard to do it, and he's very sincere, and we appreciate that. But the meaning was shifting around, and that's going to be a problem. The other case is, well, what happens if somebody is just forgetting things? Well, that can happen too. So the Gemara now is going to talk about many of the Amoraic teachings about somebody who makes a mistake when they're reciting the Shemona Esrei. So Rabbi Yosef ben Chanina says in the name of Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel, if one erred in one of the first 3 blessings, he returns to the beginning of the Shemona Esrei and he starts it new. Now, why would this be? As we were covering, the first 3 blessings are all devoted to the single theme of praising the Holy One, Hashem. So if you're making a mistake, this would also be similar if you're doing it privately as well, and you've made big blunders in this thing, you would have to go back and start it all over again. This is what this is saying. This wouldn't just be a case of the Shaliach Tzibbur. This would be a case of a private prayer as well. Now, in the case of a Shaliach Tzibbur and he's forgetting things, it would be where the Shaliach Tzibbur who omitted a blessing does have to go back and recite it just like a private person. But if the case of where he can recall what he omitted and forgot, then he returns and he corrects his error. But if he can't do so, he has to be replaced. And this, by the way, is going to be the same in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. You can see more about that in Bavli 29a. And also, halachic authorities like the Rambam also say that. In Hilchas Tefillah 10:1, it says that, the Torah says that, Shulchan Aruch says that. So it's very serious to get this right, because again, you can be blemishing the meaning of this. And this is another way to think about it. Is you imagine like somebody's trying to write a Torah scroll and they can't write it. There's a problem with the way their hands work, and they just can't write well. And so the letters are all mixed up, jumbled up. You can't tell what's what. And it's a problem. It's a problem because you can end up affecting meaning, and we're not allowed to change the Torah. Just like with this, we're not allowed to change these prayers. So going and making a blemish in the first three blessings, whether it's going to be a personal prayer or it's going to be the Shaliach Tzibbur, you got to go back and start anew, because this is talking about the praise of Hashem. Now, there's another teaching about this. Ada bar Hanya, citing Geniva in the name of Rav, says, if one erred in one of the last three blessings, he returns to the first of those three blessings, which deal with the renewal of the temple service. Now, the last three, it mentions temple service, it mentions thanksgiving, that's the modim, and then it's talking about peace. So these are all things that you want to receive after your personal appeal in that middle 12. So again, you have the first three, you have that middle 12, and you have the last three. And don't forget, we also have in an extra prayer by Shmuel Katan, which is going to be coming up, about the prayer of the heretics, and a quick end to that. So there's going to be another point about these last two rulings, and then it's going to add a new point. So Rabbi Chelbo, citing Rav Huna in the name of Rav, says, if one erred in one of the first three blessings, he returns to the beginning of the Shemona Esrei. And if one erred in the last three blessings, he returns to the first of those three blessings, which deals with the renewal of the temple service. And if one erred in one of the middle blessings and cannot recall where he made a mistake, he returns to the place that is clear to him. In other words, to the last blessing that definitely was not corrupted. And then he proceeds from there in the usual way. So the Gemara now is going to tell a story about an incident relating to this. And it says that Rabbi Acha and Rabbi Yudah ben Pazi were sitting in a certain synagogue, and someone came forward and went before the ark to lead the prayers, and he omitted one blessing. And the congregants went and asked Rabbi Simon whether he must return and recite the blessing. And Rabbi Simon answered them in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and he said, even if a prayer leader omitted two or three blessings, we do not make him return and recite them. Well, that's a big chiddush, because isn't this what we've been talking about? So here's what the Haredim says. The Haredim says, although a private person who omitted a blessing must go back and say it, a Shaliach Tzibbur who omits even several blessings need not go back, because it would be burdensome to the congregation. And the Haredim is referring to Hilchos Tefillah 10:3 in the Rambam, and also is referring to the Tosafot in Tanis 3b. And he explains, according to our Mishnah, which requires the replacement of a Shaliach Tzibbur, it refers to one who omitted a blessing and is unable to go back and say it. But the Mishnah is referring not to somebody who omitted a blessing and is unable to go back, but to someone who simply stopped and cannot proceed. So this would be like the case of the guy who's mispronouncing everything with these big changes in the letters to change the meanings, and he can't continue because you're not actually reciting the prayer. You've actually ended up changing the prayers and changing the meanings, and it's a big problem. So the Baraisa is going to list several exceptions to this ruling that a prayer leader who omits a blessing need not go back to say them. And the Gemara says that a Tana was found who distinguishes between these blessings. For the omission of any blessing, we do not make the prayer leader go back and correct his error, except for one who omitted one of these three blessings, either one who resurrects the dead, who humbles wanton sinners, and who builds Jerusalem. And if a prayer leader omitted one of these three, he is removed immediately. So the Haredim points out that if he's unable to go back immediately, we do not wait for him to recall the omitted words, but we replace him right away. And the Rosh Cirilio points out that whereas Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi holds that the omission of a blessing by Shaliach Tzibbur never need be corrected, the following Tana holds that there are exceptions. Now, what's the big deal about these ones, right? What's so specific about these ones being left out? And today Yeshua is going to explain, and he says, one who omits the blessing of who resurrects the dead possibly denies the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. And one who omits the blessing who humbles wanton sinners, well, they might be a heretic who doesn't want to curse himself. And one who omits the blessing who builds Jerusalem might deny the belief in the coming of the Mashiach. And this gives us like a theological point, because they might want to leave these out for theological reasons. So that's a good point. Now we're going to get into an amazing story about the 19th blessing, and that's going to be the part about the heretics. So the Gemara records an incident. I'm sorry. Hold on. Let me read this again. So a Tana was found who distinguishes between the blessings. For the omission of any of these blessings, we do not make the prayer leader go back and correct his error, except for one who omitted one of these three blessings, who resurrects the dead, who humbles wanton sinners, and who builds Jerusalem. And if the prayer leader, so the Gemara continues, as if a prayer leader omitted one of these three, he is removed immediately. And this anonymous Tana is saying, because I say and suspect that he is a heretic. In other words, that it could be done for a theological point, and we see that is nothing new, that it happened with the Saddukim, who sometimes would try to take over in the service for Yom Kippur and change the service in Yom Kippur for a theological point. And there was a story where one of the Saddukim Kohanim did that, and they stoned him to death with the etrogim. So he was trying to deny the water, pouring the water on the altar, and he didn't hold by the sages about the water. So what he did was he stood next to the altar, and he didn't pour the water on the altar. He poured the water on his feet instead of the altar. So they saw that, and all the people pelted him to death with the etrogs. But in the course of doing that, also damaged the altar, and any damage on the altar, you can't use it. So Shmuel Katan, Mar's going to talk about Shmuel Katan, and he went before the ark to lead the prayers, and he omitted the blessing of who humbles wanton sinners. Now, this is amazing because this is actually the person who composed for Rabban Gamliel the 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 blessing of who humbles wanton sinners. So he himself is the one who was leading it and forgot who humbles wanton sinners. Perhaps he had some anxiety or something. Perhaps the text slipped his mind because of anxiety, because he was leading the congregation in prayer. Or perhaps he was used to the old formulation of the Shemona Esrei and it was automatic for him. And maybe it was early on after they added his own text into it. And, what would happen, because, this is the person who wrote the text against heresy. So what do? So Gemara says, in the end, after he had begun the next blessing, and the people notified him of the error, he started looking at them to see whether they would remove him. And they said to him, the sages did not consider you. In other words, when the sages were saying that a prayer leader who omits the blessing is removed, they were talking about somebody who might not be righteous. They're not referring to somebody who's, the Gadol Ador, who is righteous and who's above any suspicion of heresy, because he himself wrote the text that we all use against the heretics, which is the 19th blessing in the Shemona Esrei. Now, the Gemara is going to discuss a different type of omission from the Shemona Esrei. When you recite Shemona Esrei on Rosh Chodesh, one has to add the prayer of Yaleh V'Yavo, and that's going to mention about the nature of the day, and that's going to be added to the blessing of the temple service. And the Gemara now is going to talk about the law where somebody suspects that he failed to add this insertion on the Rosh Chodesh in the Shemona Esrei. And the Gemara says, Rav Yaakov Bar Acha, citing Rav Shimon Bar Abba in the name of Rabbi Elazar, says, if one is uncertain whether or not he mentioned Rosh Chodesh by including Yaleh V'Yavo in the Shemona Esrei, we make him go back and say Yaleh V'Yavo. In other words, that somebody definitely omitted this. Okay, he has to go back and say it. And this Gemara now is hinting that, or teaching that, this is even going to apply if somebody's unsure and uncertain. Now, that's going to be interesting because the text of Shemona Esrei is a rabbinic institution, and if you have a doubt involving something with rabbinic law, it's going to be lenient. But we see here that this doubt is different because it's going to be stringent. Now, that's what's going to be very unusual about this. So what's going on here? Now, the question is, because this is rabbinic in nature for this prayer, why is it that he has to go back and say it? And by the way, this ends up being the ruling that's adopted by most of the poskim, including the Beit Yosef and the Taz and the Bach. It's in the Mishnah Beur, by the way. And it's going to be interesting on why, on something that's a rabbinic institution, in this case, it's going to be led as strict in the Yerushalmi here. And actually, when those poskim over there, like in the Mishnah Beur, are ruling stringently on it, it's actually coming from this sugya as the source, which is interesting. So you might want to do some research on why this is going to be different from other rabbinic things that are going to be a little bit lenient in the case of a doubt. Why would this be stringent? Perhaps it could be because this was composed by prophets. That's the first thing that jumps to my mind. But something else about this that I want to point out is that this is not the halacha lemaisa that what I'm going to say, right? The Bavli holds that this is not derabanan. Well, the Yerushalmi holds that these prayers are derabanan, right? So the formulation of the Yerushalmi holds that, hey, you have to do these prayers, and that actually this is these 3 prayers a day are actually going to be deraita, that this is a deraita obligation. It's not derabanan. The Bavli is holding this as derabanan. The Yerushalmi is actually holding it's deraita. So so it's interesting that the poskim adopted this from where in the Bavli and how we are doing it, right? We're doing it because we're saying that this is a rabbinic institution, right? We're not going by the Yerushalmi and saying that it's a deraita thing. But if you were to say this would be deraita and there would be a mistake on this, then certainly this sugya would be consistent, and you would say there's no problem at all. What's interesting is that for treating it like on the Bavli, and where you're saying that it's going to be a case of doubt where it's going to be lenient, the halacha lemaisa from most of the poskim, again including Beit Yosef, Bach, Taz, Mishnah Beur, the Ramah. I mean, it's going to be that, and this is going to be the source, but it's going to be that you have to get him to go back. And again, it's interesting because normally in a case of doubt with something that's derabanan, that's going to be lenient, not stringent. Here it's held as stringent. So there's a lot going on here. The Gemara is going to ask a question. It's going to say, to where in the Shemona Esrei does he return? And the Gemara answers. It says, Shimon Barva says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that it depends on when he realized that he admitted Yaleh Vayavo. And the Gemara continues and says, if he realized after he lifted his feet, in other words, by starting to take the 3 steps back at the end of the Shemona Esrei, and he returns to the beginning of the Shemona Esrei, but if he had not lifted his feet, he returns to the blessing of the temple service. Now, the Gemara is going to present a case where even if someone realized the omission before going back, he nevertheless returns to the start of the Shemona Esrei. He has to start again. Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi says, if upon concluding the Shemona Esrei his mind wandered and he forgot to lift his feet, he is treated like one who already lifted his feet. In other words, if he remembered that he had omitted Yaleh Vayavo on the Rosh Chodesh, and he returns not to the blessing of the temple service, but he actually ends up going to the beginning of the Shemona Esrei itself. Now, the Haredim is going to point out, since he would have lifted his feet were it not for his accidental forgetfulness, he is legally equivalent to one who did lift his feet. So that's the explanation by the Haredim for why that would be. The Gemara is going to raise a question regarding one who usually recites additional supplications after taking the 3 steps back. And it says, and in the case of one who realizes the omission of Yaleh Vayavo, when he is reciting these additional supplications, the law requires investigation. So that comes up sometimes. Sometimes in the Gemara, it will leave it vague and say that it requires investigation. So I was actually learning the Mishnah Beur yesterday afternoon, and in another case on Shabbat, it was getting into a dialogue and a discussion, and how did it ended? Well, the Gemara ended from the Bavli side, saying that the Gemara ended saying it requires additional investigation. So we have that case over here. So, it's leaving us with a real question here. So here's what the question ends up being, and we're going to use the Haredim to help us to understand it. Haredim says that the Gemara says that one who lifted his feet at the end of the Shemona Esrei, as you would normally have done if your attention had not been diverted, they certainly finished their prayer, says Haredim, and therefore it was speaking of a person who does not usually say supplications after stepping back. And in that case, lifting the feet surely clearly shows that his prayer is ended. And here, the reference is to a person who usually does add supplications after stepping back. And so now the question arises whether to view them as part of the prayer. In other words, when we step back and you're saying these additional supplications that are in the modern prayer book, is this going to be part of the Shemona Esrei prayer or not? That's really going to be the question. The Haredim points out that on one hand, it could be argued that since he is still reciting supplications, he has not yet concluded his prayer, and thus he need return only to the blessing of the temple service to go back and say this forgotten Yaleh Vayavo on the Rosh Chodesh. But on the other hand, since he has already lifted his feet, perhaps he has concluded his prayer, and he should actually return to the beginning of the Shemona Esrei and say it again. So that's going to be the question. So according to the Haredim about this, if his mind wandered, it means that he forgot to take 3 steps back. And many other commentators understand this wording as meaning that the person stopped focusing on the prayers in the Shemona Esrei, so that he usually recites the last blessing before raising his feet, and that is that he finished saying supplications, was ready to take 3 steps back. So the Gemara is teaching that we view him as though he had already stepped back, and now if he remembers the Yaleh Vayavo at that point, he actually has to go back to the beginning of the Shemona Esrei. That's going to be the point by the Bavli, as enumerated by the Meiri, and that's actually going to be the accepted halacha for the day. But it's actually the Yerushalmi actually just ends it off by saying that these require investigation. So perhaps when it's saying it requires investigation, it might actually be talking about that they do know the halacha, but you have to look at the case of the person on when it happened. Is this going to be a person who is saying additional supplications after they've stepped back and they've bowed, or is this going to be a case where that's not, where they're not saying extra supplications, or it's going to be something like what the Haredim is saying, where the person, before he stepped back, basically his mind wandered and he's effectively stopped. It's as if he's lifted his feet already, because his mind has wandered so much at this point. So that's going to be what it means when it's saying that this law requires investigation, that you're actually going to have to look at the case itself to determine, because there's a lot of things that could have happened. The Mishnah now is going to rule that if a prayer leader stops in the middle of the blessing, his replacement must go back to the beginning of that blessing. And the Gemara is going to present a similar law regarding the Torah reader. Rabbi Abba, the son of Rabbi Chia bar Abba, citing Rabbi Chia in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, says that if one who was reading from the Torah is struck dumb, and one who takes his place begins where the first reader begins, this must be so. For if you say that he begins where the first reader stopped, then the first verse, those read by the original reader, would have a blessing recited before them, but not a blessing recited after them. and the last verses, those read by the second reader, would have a blessing recited after them, but not a blessing recited before them. And this is not allowed because it is written, this is going to be in Tehillim 19:8, it says, the Torah of Hashem is complete, restoring the soul. And the Gemara says this verse teaches that it must be entirely complete. So that, basically every verse of the Torah reading must be completed by a blessing that precedes it and a blessing that follows it. Now, the Pnei Moshe points out that the blessings that precede and the blessings that follow each passage of the Torah reading must be intended for every verse in that passage that's going to be read. So, Pnei Moshe says that it's inadequate for the preliminary blessing to cover only the first blessings of that passage, and the final blessings to cover only the last verses. In other words, let's say somebody's coming up and the person is struck dumb. He can't read. He's so in awe of the Torah, he forgets how to read. Okay, it can happen. So they call up the Goan for the first reading. The guy is struck dumb. The Torah reader is struck dumb. And he reads, only a couple of pasukim, and he stops. Well, you've started with a Torah blessing, and now you have to go and replace it. Well, again, Torah readings, have to be completed. And when you're starting a Torah reading, there's a blessing that starts it, and there's a blessing that ends it. Well, now effectively what this is saying, what Rabbi Yochanan is effectively saying through this chain of transmission, is that if you're leaving off in the middle after reading a couple of pasukim and you're bringing a new person to read it, well, that new person to read it has to say a bracha. But you've already read a couple of these. So it ends up becoming problematic. So what they're saying is that, they're talking about, going back and starting at that beginning of the blessing. In other words, you can't accept those two pasukim and continue from there, because you get into a problem where you've said a bracha for a partial reading of the Torah, and you're not supposed to do that. So that's why it's saying that you got to go back and start, because it becomes problems in the brachas for starting and ending. It becomes incomplete, and you're breaking it up. And so they're saying from this asmata that this is showing from this verse that it has to be entirely complete. Now, regarding the law of a Torah passage read by two people, one after the other, the Gemara is going to discuss whether the Torah can be read by two people at the same time. That's going to be something very curious. And there's a brisa that teaches, says the Gemara, two people may not read together from the Torah, even if one person translates. So in the old days, as we were covering yesterday, a lot of times there would be a translator who would come in to hear the Hebrew text and translate it to the local language of the day so that people could understand it. Now, what this is saying is that you can't have that translator hear the text and translate as the person's hearing it. That the Torah has to be read in a complete way by itself, and then the translation would occur after that. Now, this brings up the problem of people talking during Torah readings in a shul. And it's a problem because now you have, it's a similar case, right? It's not going to allow a translation, as this Gemara is saying, to be occurring at the same time as a Torah reading. So, therefore, you're also having somebody who, is talking also in the middle of the Torah reading in the shul is also going to be a very big problem for that. The Gemara is going to explain why two people may not read simultaneously from the Torah. And Rabbi Zera says this is forbidden because of the blessing. The blessing being, says the Haredim, it's referring to the formula of Baruch Hu, that's going to introduce the blessing that starts off the Torah reading, and it's gonna it's gonna in the initial part of Baruch um, it may not be said by more than one person, right? Because um, when when the scripture is stating in Tehillim 34:4, declare the greatness of Hashem with me, okay, where it's talking about declare, it's saying Godlu, which is plural, uh, while et with me is singular. So um, this is going to be talking about a a a case where uh, that no more than one person can be speaking at a time during a Torah reading. Okay, so Rabbi Zera says this is forbidden. This is forbidden because of the blessing, and it says that if two people read from the Torah, both must recite the blessing, but the blessing may be said by only one person because Baruch Hu, it's a declaration where you know part of it is implying singular, and within the Baruch Hu blessing uh, and implying singular. If you were to have two people saying it, uh, you know, two people were to be saying and two people to be reading it, you would have a problem because then you have basically bracha levatala occurring, right? Because you have a formulation of a text where the blessing is going to be singular, and now you have two people reading it, two people saying the Torah reading at the same time. Well, that's effectively going to be bracha levatala. So the and that, by the way, is also the opinion of Rabbi Kanievsky that if he says it in his Beur shir that basically he's saying that the reason two people may not say these blessings is that it would appear to be addressing two deities, so that you could go back to this problem of dualism, and also that Rabbi Kanievsky is pointing out that since only one person needs to say the blessing, if another would say it as well, he's also going to be violating the prohibition of saying a blessing in vain. So it ends up being a problem for theological problems, a problem for bracha levatala. It's a mess. So we don't do it that way. The Gemara is going to reject this reason and offer a different reason why we don't have two people read from the Torah at the same time. And it says, but the continuation of the Brisa teaches two people may not translate the Torah together, even if one person reads. Now, why should two people be forbidden to translate together? And the Gemara says, can you say that it is because of the blessing, but a translator does not say the blessing? Rather, two people may not simultaneously translate or read because two sounds do not enter one ear. In other words, when two people speak at the same time, they are not heard clearly. So this is going to be another reason why we don't talk in shul. This is another reason why it's particularly odious to talk while the Torah is being read, because as this Gemara is saying, when there are two sounds, they don't enter the ear the same way as one sound, and that this is offering a different reason. Not that there's a bracha levatala issue, that you're going to have two people having to read it, and that there's a problem in the bracha because the bracha is going to be in the singular. Rather, it's going to be that you can't hear this clearly. And the Or HaChaim in 141.2 points out that two people may not read together because two sounds do not enter one ear, which is literally from this sugya. And it says, therefore, if one person reads from the Torah and another recites the blessings, as is a practice nowadays, although the later should read along with the reader, he may do so quietly. So the Gemara is going to continue, and then we're going to finish up, and then we'll do the next Mishnah tomorrow. The Gemara is going to say, where the previous Brisa forbids the Torah to be read by two people simultaneously, the following Brisa permits this practice. So there's a Brisa that teaches two people may not read together from the Torah, but two people may not read together from the prophets. So literally, that's going to be the Haftarah, that's going to be the reading of the prophets, because that's going to be, a conclusion of the public reading of the scriptures. This perhaps could be talking about a case where a person, on his own in the shul, is going to read together with the Torah, but he's going to read it quietly so that nobody else can hear him. That's going to be permissible because he's not disrupting anybody. But I think, the issue that we've been talking about is a case where what happens if two people go up to be the Torah reader for the whole congregation, and one person is reading and one person is translating simultaneously to a group of 40 people. That's what we're going to have a problem with. But you're not going to have a problem with some guy off on the side who's hearing the Torah reading and he's reading it quietly to himself. There's no issue there. The question is going to be, well, what's going on with the prophets? So the reason this Brisa is going to be distinguishing between the Torah and the prophets is like this. Rabbi Ula says in this Gemara, people are familiar with the Torah, so they will discern the words of the Torah, even if it were to be read by two readers, but they are not familiar with the prophets, and they will not discern the words of the prophets if it were to be read by two leaders. So because people are not studying prophets as much and they're not as familiar with it, if you were to put two people up and two people were to be reading simultaneously, or there'd be noise, let's say people are talking about other things in a shul during the Haftorah reading, well, people can't really discern it. So you have a lot of problems with even just, the modern, sad approach of talking in shul, during the service, which is a terrible blight on the people. The Mishnah now was talking about, and he should not refuse. In other words, if the prayer leader stops in the middle of the service and someone else is asked to replace him, he should not refuse at that time. The implication is that in normal circumstances, when one is asked to serve as a prayer leader in the first place, you're allowed to refuse. But now this is talking about when the person gets replaced. Now we're going to talk about the decree, how much before where one, is going to be allowed to refuse. Okay, what's going to be refusal? So the Gemara starts off and says, Rabbi Yeshua of the South said, 3 things are bad in large or small amounts, but good in intermediate amounts. They are yeast, salt, and refusing to serve as prayer leader. How then should somebody react if they're asked to lead the prayers? And the Gemara continues, it says, the first one is asked, he should refuse as if to say that he is unworthy of the honor. The second time, he should bestir himself as if to rise. And the third time, he should run and go lead the prayers. And there's a related incident. Rabbi Eliezer, this is going to be the Tana, and the stories talk about Rabbi Eliezer, the Tana. He was sitting in synagogue, and the Gabbai went and badgered somebody to go up and lead the congregation in the prayer, but the person did not want to accept the assignment to go up and lead the prayer. And at the end of the prayers, he, the one who refused to serve as the prayer leader, went to Rabbi Eliezer, and he said to him, my master should not be angry with me. I did not go up to lead the prayers because I did not feel inspired. And Rabbi Eliezer said to him, I was not angry with you, but with the one who badgered you. In other words, the Rosh Cirilio is pointing out that he didn't have the calm and the composure needed to inspire himself so he could lead the congregation in prayer. And according to Pnei Moshe, that this person at that time had a certain physical heaviness, and the Elei Tamar points out that he should have realized that he probably had a good reason for refusing to leave the prayers, and the Elei Tamar is pointing out that you should not pester a person to lead the prayers, and about Derech Eretz. Now, this law, says the Elei Tamar, is not codified by the poskim. However, this is in here, and it's probably good to be sensitive to the person. Perhaps he's not feeling well that day, and he doesn't want to be bothered. So don't pester him. The Mishnah taught that when a prayer leader cannot continue, he must be replaced, and his substitute starts from the beginning of the interrupted blessing. And the Gemara considers the law of a prayer leader who stopped while saying Yotzer Or. That's going to be the first blessing in the morning Shema. Now, Betitai, that's going to be the name of the prayer leader. He was struck dumb while reciting the passage of Ophanim in the blessing of Yetzer Or. This is going to be talking about the heavenly luminaries, and it's going to be talking about how the angels praise Hashem in this prayer. And in that section, it's saying then the Ophanim and the holy Chayos give praise. So this fellow, he was struck dumb while reciting it. And the Gemara continues, says that they went and asked Rabbi Avin where Betatai's substitute should begin. And Rabbi Avin answered them in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who said, one who leads the prayers in his place should begin from where he left off and from where the beginning of the Ophanim passage is. And they asked Rabbi Avin, but we learned in a Mishnah, one who replaces a prayer leader should start from the beginning of the blessing in which the prayer leader erred and made a mistake. And in our case, he should start from the beginning of Yotzer Or. The Gemara is going to continue and says, Rabbi Avin answered them and says, once you recited Kedusha, that's going to be the verse that says, holy, 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 okay, it is as if you have finished the blessing of Yotzer Or. And then the next section of Ophanim is going to be the beginning of a new blessing. In other words, that the blessing of glory that ends with holy, 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 and the blessing and statement of Kedusha, that's effectively going to be a end of this part of the blessing. And then when you're going on to the next part on the Ophanim, that's going to be the start of a second part of that blessing and a standalone. And that's going to be the point of Rabbi Avin. So it gives us deeper insight as to the structure when we're saying Yotzer Or, and we can see how this is to be read and organized. We're supposed to read the part before where we say holy, holy, holy. We're supposed to see that part as its own thing, and the part after as its own thing. And very interesting for us to be able to understand other points about what to do on Rosh Chodesh and the importance of the Shaliach Tzibbur and the responsibility. And there's a lot going on here to help us to deepen our understanding and to get a better sense of the basics for how this is all working, so we can improve our quality of prayer and we can get closer to Kodesh Baruch Hu. Have a great day.